Welcome to Her True Stories, where we share tales of women who refuse to be victims, who turn their pain into power, and who prove that sometimes the best revenge is simply being smarter than those who underestimate you. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted, if you've ever felt powerless in the face of cruelty, this story is for you. Don't just listen and leave. Hit subscribe so you'll never miss another story that speaks to your soul. Ring that notification bell because today's story about Margot Delaney will show you that sometimes the quietest vengeance is the most devastating. Let's begin. My name is Margot Delaney, and at 58 years old, I thought I understood grief. I thought I knew what it meant to lose everything that mattered. But standing in the living room of the Connecticut home I'd shared with my husband Richard for 15 years, staring at the mahogany urn that held his ashes, I was about to learn that some betrayals cut deeper than death itself. Richard had been gone for exactly 7 days. 7 days since the heart attack that took him in his sleep. 7 days since I'd held his hand one last time in the hospital. 7 days since I'd become a widow at 58, with no children of my own and a stepson who'd made it clear years ago that he tolerated me only because his father demanded it. The house felt impossibly quiet that Tuesday morning. I'd taken leave from my job at the Fairfield Public Library, where I'd worked for over 20 years, first as a reference librarian and eventually as head of research services. Books had always been my refuge, my way of understanding the world through other people's stories. But now, surrounded by the silence of my own story, I felt lost in a way that no amount of reading had prepared me for. I was arranging the sympathy flowers that had been arriving since the funeral when the phone rang. The sharp sound cut through the stillness like a blade, and for a moment, my heart leaped with the irrational hope that it might be Richard, that this whole nightmare had been some terrible mistake. But when I answered, the voice on the other end was coldly familiar. Margot. Bradley's voice held none of the warmth one might expect from a grieving son calling his stepmother. If anything, he sounded pleased. I hope you're sitting down. Bradley Delaney was 35 years old, Richard's son from his first marriage to a woman who died when Bradley was 12. Richard had raised him as a single father until he met me, and though I'd tried for 15 years to build some kind of relationship with Bradley, he'd made it clear that I was an intruder in what he considered his rightful inheritance. Hello, Bradley, I said carefully, settling into Richard's favorite armchair. How are you holding up? Better than fine, actually. That's why I'm calling. There was something in his tone that made my skin crawl, a smugness that I'd heard before but never quite this pronounced. I wanted to let you know that I've sold Dad's car. You've what? The words didn't make sense. Richard's beloved 1967 Mustang, the car he'd restored with his own hands, the car he'd planned to leave to the local classic car museum. Bradley, you can't have. Oh, but I did. Got a great price for it too. $15,000 cash. He paused, and I could practically hear his smile through the phone. The house is next. The room seemed to tilt around me. What are you talking about? I'm talking about reality, Margot. Dad's gone, and it's time for you to face facts. This house, this property, everything, it all belongs to me now. So you should probably start looking for a place to stay. I'm putting the house on the market next week. I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles went white. Bradley, that's not, you can't just... Let's not pretend you were ever really family, he continued, his voice growing colder with each word. You were a convenience for my father, a nice companion for his golden years. But you were never a Delaney, not really. And now that Dad's gone, there's no reason to keep up the charade. The cruelty of it took my breath away. It wasn't just the words themselves, though they cut deep enough. It was the ease with which he said them, the casual dismissal of 15 years of marriage, of love, of the life I'd built with his father. As if I were luggage to be left at the terminal. The lawyer will be in touch about the details, Bradley said, his tone now businesslike, as if he were discussing the weather. But I wanted to give you a heads up out of, what's the word? Courtesy. You have 30 days to clear out your personal belongings. Anything of Dad's stays with the house, obviously. Bradley, wait. But the line had already gone dead. I sat there for a long moment, the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the dial tone and trying to process what had just happened. The sympathy flowers suddenly seemed to mock me with their bright colors and condolences from people who assumed I would be grieving in the comfort and security of my own home. But this wasn't my home anymore, apparently. According to Bradley, it had never been my home at all. I walked slowly to Richard's study, a room I'd barely entered since his death because it still smelled like his cologne and the pipe tobacco he'd given up years ago but whose scent seemed permanently embedded in the leather furniture. His desk was exactly as he'd left it, paper scattered with his characteristic disorder, reading glasses folded next to a half-finished crossword puzzle, a coffee mug with a ring stain that I'd always nagged him to use a coaster under. On the bookshelf behind his desk was our wedding photo from 15 years ago. Richard had been 51 then, a distinguished professor of history at Yale with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. I'd been 43, a lifelong bachelor girl who'd thought love had passed her by until this gentle, intellectual man walked into the library looking for research materials on the Civil War and ended up asking me to dinner instead. We'd married 6 months later in a small ceremony at the Botanical Gardens, with Bradley in reluctant attendance and a handful of close friends and colleagues. Richard had been so happy that day, spinning me around in my simple cream-colored dress, while jazz music played and fairy lights twinkled overhead. Finally, he'd whispered in my ear, finally, I have my happy ending. But apparently, Bradley saw it differently. To him, our marriage had been an intrusion, a theft of what should have been his exclusive claim on his father's love and estate. And now, with Richard gone, he was ready to erase me entirely. I picked up the wedding photo, tracing Richard's smile with my finger. What do I do now? I whispered to the empty room. How do I fight this? That's when I remembered Charlotte. Charlotte Paxton had been Richard's colleague at Yale, a brilliant attorney who specialized in estate law and had harbored what she thought was a secret crush on my husband for years before our marriage. She'd been devastated when he chose me, but over time, we developed an unlikely friendship. Charlotte respected intelligence and spine, and she told me once that she admired how I'd handled Bradley's hostility with grace and dignity. More importantly, Charlotte knew exactly how vindictive and entitled Bradley could be. She'd been at dinner parties where he'd made snide comments about gold diggers and late-life mistakes. She'd seen him storm out when Richard announced he was updating his will to include me. If anyone would understand what I was facing, it would be Charlotte. I found her business card in Richard's desk drawer, tucked behind a stack of legal documents that I suddenly realized I should probably examine more carefully. My hands were shaking as I dialed her number. Charlotte Paxton, came the crisp, professional voice. Charlotte, it's Margot Delaney, Richard's wife. The word felt strange in my mouth now, like a title I was no longer sure I had the right to claim. Margot. Her voice immediately softened. How are you holding up, dear? I've been thinking about you constantly since the funeral. Not well, I admitted, and suddenly I was crying, not the gentle, dignified tears I'd been shedding all week, but ugly, desperate sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep in my chest. Charlotte, I need help. Bradley just called and told me he's selling the house. He says I have 30 days to get out, that I was never really family. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that I wondered if the call had dropped. When Charlotte finally spoke, her voice was deadly quiet. That little bastard. Can he do this? Legally, I mean. I know Richard left everything to him in his will. But... Margot, stop. Take a breath. Charlotte's voice had shifted into what I thought of as her lawyer mode, calm, controlled, and slightly dangerous. Did Richard ever discuss his estate planning with you? In detail, I mean? Not really. He always said Bradley would inherit the bulk of everything, since he was his only child. I never asked for more than that. I just assumed. You assumed you'd have some basic security, which is reasonable and which Richard would have wanted. I could hear papers rustling in the background. Margot, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Do not sign anything Bradley gives you. Do not agree to anything. Do not even respond to his calls.
Can you do that?
Yes, but I'm coming over.
Right now.
We need to go through Richard's papers, all of them. And Margot? Bradley may have just made the biggest mistake of his entitled little life. After Charlotte hung up, I sat in Richard's study feeling something I hadn't experienced in days. Hope. Not the false hope of denial, but the real thing, the possibility that this story wasn't over, that I wasn't as powerless as Bradley assumed. I began pulling open desk drawers, looking for anything that might be relevant. Bills, correspondence, old lecture notes, and then, in the bottom drawer, locked with a small key that Richard had always kept on his key ring, I found a manila folder labeled Estate Planning, Confidential. Inside were documents I'd never seen before. Legal papers with Charlotte's firm letterhead, amendments and codicils dated just 6 months ago, and a handwritten note in Richard's careful script. For my beloved Margot, you gave me the best years of my life. Now let me give you the security you deserve. My hands were trembling as I read through the legal language, trying to understand what I was seeing. But one thing was clear. Richard had made changes to his will that Bradley apparently knew nothing about. When Charlotte arrived an hour later, she took one look at the documents spread across the desk and began to smile, not a pleasant smile, but the sharp, predatory grin of a shark who'd just smelled blood in the water. "Oh, Margot," she said, settling into the chair across from Richard's desk. "This is going to be fun." Charlotte spent the next 3 hours going through every document in Richard's study with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent decades untangling complex estates. I made coffee and watched her work, noting the way her expression grew more satisfied with each page she reviewed. Charlotte was 62, 4 years older than me, with steel gray hair that she wore in a sharp bob and the kind of fierce intelligence that had made her one of the most respected estate attorneys in Connecticut. She'd never married, never found a man worth giving up my independence for, she'd told me once, and had instead built a practice that specialized in protecting the interests of widows and second wives from grasping relatives. Richard was thorough, she said finally, sitting back in her chair and removing her reading glasses. More thorough than I expected, actually, and much more devious. What do you mean? Charlotte held up a document thick with legal seals and notarizations. This is a codicil to Richard's original will, dated 6 months ago. Do you remember him going anywhere unusual around that time? Meeting with lawyers, perhaps? I thought back to the spring, trying to remember anything out of the ordinary. He said he had some university business in Hartford. Meetings about his pension and retirement planning. He was gone for most of a day, but he seemed, I don't know, pleased when he came back. Like he'd accomplished something important. I'll bet he was pleased. Charlotte's smile was growing sharper by the minute. Margot, did you know that your name is still on the deed to this house? What? But Richard said a lot of things to keep the peace with Bradley. But the legal reality is quite different. She spread several documents across the desk. When Richard married you, he added your name to the deed as joint tenants with right of survivorship. That means the house belongs to you now, not to Bradley. I stared at the papers, trying to process what she was telling me. But the will... The original will left everything to Bradley, yes. But this codicil changes things significantly. Charlotte pointed to a section highlighted in yellow. Richard left you 75% of his estate, including all real estate, investments, and personal property. Bradley gets 25% and some specific family heirlooms. That can't be right. Richard would have told me. Would he? Think about it, Margot. Richard knew his son. He knew how Bradley would react to being essentially disinherited. He probably planned to tell you after he retired, when he could better manage Bradley's inevitable tantrum. Charlotte leaned forward, her eyes bright with professional excitement. But here's the beautiful part. Bradley has been operating under the assumption that he inherited everything. He's already sold property that doesn't belong to him. The car, for instance, that's theft. And if he's planning to sell this house, that would be fraud, I said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn.
Exactly.
And not just simple fraud. We're talking about real estate fraud, which is a felony in Connecticut. Charlotte gathered the papers into a neat stack. Margot, Bradley has essentially been digging his own grave for the past week. The question is, do we stop him now, or do we let him keep digging? The logical thing would have been to stop him immediately, to prevent any further crimes and protect what was rightfully mine. But something in Charlotte's tone, some hint of calculated mischief, made me pause. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that Bradley is arrogant enough to hang himself if we give him enough rope. Right now, he's committed petty theft and is planning major fraud. But if we let him continue, if we monitor his actions and document everything he does, we might be able to destroy him completely. Why would you want to do that? I mean, professionally, wouldn't it be better to just stop this now? Charlotte was quiet for a moment, her expression thoughtful. Can I tell you something in confidence? Something I probably shouldn't admit as an attorney. I nodded. I've watched Bradley treat you like garbage for 15 years. I've seen him make you feel small and unwanted in your own home. I've watched him poison family gatherings with his resentment and entitlement. Her voice was growing harder with each word. And more than that, I loved Richard too. Not the way you did, but I loved him. He was a good man who deserved better than a son who saw him only as a source of inheritance. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where Richard had spent so many happy hours. Bradley thinks he can erase you, Margot. He thinks he can pretend the last 15 years never happened, that his father's happiness meant nothing. Well, I think it's time someone taught him otherwise. What exactly are you proposing? Charlotte turned back to me, and her smile was absolutely predatory. I'm proposing that we let Bradley commit every crime he's planning to commit. We document everything, build an airtight case, and then we destroy him so completely that he'll wish he'd never heard your name. Is that legal? Ethically, I mean. Perfectly legal. We're not entrapping him or encouraging him to commit crimes. He's already decided to do that on his own. We're simply allowing him to face the full consequences of his choices. I thought about the phone call that morning, about the casual cruelty in Bradley's voice when he told me I was never really family. I thought about 15 years of barely concealed hostility, of holidays ruined by his resentment, of the way he'd made me feel like an interloper in my own marriage. How long would we wait? As long as it takes. A few weeks, a few months. However long it takes for him to commit enough crimes to ensure he faces serious jail time. Charlotte's expression softened slightly. Margot, I know this isn't how you usually handle conflict. You're too kind, too forgiving. But sometimes kindness is just another word for enabling. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let someone face the consequences of their choices. She was right about my nature. I'd spent my whole life avoiding conflict, smoothing over problems, trying to keep the peace. It's probably why I'd stayed single until I was 43. I'd rather be alone than deal with the messiness of human relationships. But Richard had changed that. He'd shown me that love was worth fighting for, that some things were worth protecting. And if our marriage had meant anything at all, if the 15 years of happiness we'd shared had any value, then maybe it was time to stop being so accommodating. What would I need to do? Nothing at first. We let Bradley think his plan is working. You disappear, lay low, don't respond to his calls or legal threats. Let him get comfortable with the idea that he's won. Charlotte began packing the documents into her briefcase. Meanwhile, I'll do some investigation into his business dealings. Something tells me that a man arrogant enough to steal from his stepmother might have other skeletons in his closet. And then we destroy him with the truth. We reveal that he's been stealing and defrauding people. We take back everything that's rightfully yours. And we make sure he faces criminal charges for what he's done. I looked around Richard's study one more time, at the books he'd loved and the papers he'd left behind, and the wedding photo that captured us in our moment of greatest happiness. Bradley thought he could erase all of this, could pretend it had never mattered. He was wrong. Okay, I said quietly. Let's do it. Charlotte's smile was brilliant and terrifying. Excellent. Now, the first thing we need to do is get you out of here before Bradley shows up with potential buyers. Do you have somewhere you can stay? Somewhere he won't think to look for you. I thought about it. I could stay with friends, but that would be the first place Bradley would check. I could go to a hotel, but that would leave a paper trail. And then I remembered something Richard had mentioned years ago, a small property he'd inherited from his mother, a trailer on a few acres of land about an hour north of here. He'd always meant to sell it, but had never gotten around to it. I might have an idea, I said. Somewhere quiet where I can think and plan. Perfect. Pack light, just essentials. We want Bradley to think you've given up, that you're running away defeated. Let him get overconfident. As I packed a small suitcase, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the thrill of righteous anger. Bradley had made a critical error in judgment. He'd assumed that because I was quiet and accommodating, I was also weak and helpless. He was about to learn the difference between kindness and weakness, and I was going to enjoy teaching him. I left the house at dawn the next morning, while the neighborhood still slept and before Bradley might arrive with his real estate agent. The only things I took were a single suitcase of clothes, Richard's old cigar box that contained what he'd jokingly called his treasure map, receipts, codes, and odd mementos from our travels, and the manila folder with all the estate documents. The drive north took me through small Connecticut towns that grew progressively more rural as I left the wealthy suburbs of Fairfield County behind. Richard's mother's property was in a part of the state I'd never visited, where the hills were steeper and the trees grew thicker and cell phone service became spotty. I almost missed the turnoff, a narrow dirt road marked only by a rusted mailbox with Delaney painted in faded letters. The road wound through dense woods for nearly a mile before opening into a small clearing where a modest trailer sat on a foundation of concrete blocks. It wasn't much to look at. The trailer was probably 30 years old, with aluminum siding that had faded to a dull silver and a small wooden deck that Richard's father had apparently built himself. But it was clean and quiet, and most importantly, it was completely off the grid. No neighbors for miles, no one to report my presence, no way for Bradley to find me even if he thought to look. Inside, the trailer was basic but functional. A small kitchen, a living area with a fold-out couch, a tiny bedroom, and a bathroom with a shower stall barely big enough to turn around in. The electricity worked, fed by solar panels that Richard's father had installed in some fit of environmental consciousness. There was even a landline telephone, though I doubted it would be much use given the poor cell coverage. I spent the first day settling in and taking inventory. The kitchen was stocked with canned goods and dry staples that were probably years old, but still edible. There was a small wood-burning stove for heat and a propane tank for the water heater. It was like stepping back in time to a simpler, more self-sufficient way of life. But it was also perfect for what I needed to do. No distractions, no neighbors dropping by, no unexpected visits from concerned friends. Just silence and space to think and plan. On the second day, I called Charlotte from the landline. "How's the hideaway?" she asked. "Quiet. Perfect for what we need. Have you heard anything from Bradley? Oh, yes. He's been busy. I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. He's already listed the house with a real estate agent. Asking price, $800,000. 800,000? But the house is worth at least 1.2 million, yes. He's either incompetent or desperate for a quick sale. Probably both. Charlotte paused. There's more. I had a private investigator do some preliminary research into Bradley's business dealings. Turns out your stepson has been quite creative with his real estate ventures. What kind of creative? The illegal kind. He's been flipping houses using fraudulent loan applications, claiming to live in properties he's never set foot in to qualify for owner-occupant rates. He's also been backdating purchase agreements to avoid capital gains taxes. The man is a walking tax fraud case. I felt a grim satisfaction at this news. Can you prove it? We're working on it. But Margot, there's something else. Something more personal. Charlotte's voice grew more serious. The investigator talked to some of Bradley's ex-associates. Apparently, he's been telling people for years that his father's second marriage was invalid. Something about you being a gold digger who manipulated a vulnerable widower. The words stung, even though I'd expected them. Does it matter? Legally, I mean? Not at all. Your marriage was perfectly legitimate, and the estate documents are ironclad. But it tells us something about Bradley's mindset. He's not just greedy, he's genuinely convinced that he's the victim here. That makes him dangerous, but it also makes him predictable. How so? Because he'll keep escalating. He won't be satisfied with just selling the house and stealing your inheritance. He'll want to humiliate you, to prove that he was right about you all along. And when he does that, he'll make mistakes. I spent the next week establishing a routine in my temporary home. I read voraciously, mysteries and thrillers that I'd never had time for during my working years. I took long walks in the woods, something I'd always meant to do more of. I even started a journal, documenting everything I could remember about Bradley's behavior over the years, building a psychological profile that might be useful later. But mostly I planned. In the evenings, I would sit at the small kitchen table with Richard's cigar box, going through the accumulated detritus of our 15-year marriage. Ticket stubs from trips to Europe, receipts from anniversary dinners, love letters he'd written me during the brief period early in our marriage when he'd traveled to research a book, business cards from people we'd met at conferences and faculty parties. It was in this collection of memories that I found what I was looking for. The business card for Kathy Riddle, a real estate agent we'd met at a neighborhood barbecue 3 years ago. She'd mentioned that she was looking to buy a house in our area, something to flip as an investment property. I called her from the landline the next morning. Kathy Riddle, how can I help you?
Good.
This is Margot Delaney. We met a few years ago at the Henderson's barbecue. You mentioned you were looking for investment properties in Fairfield. Oh yes, Margot. How are you? I heard about Richard. I'm so sorry for your loss. Thank you. Actually, that's why I'm calling. There's a house in my old neighborhood that just came on the market. I thought you might be interested in taking a look. Oh? What's the address? I gave her the address of my own house, the house Bradley was trying to sell. It's listed at $800,000, which seems like a steal for that neighborhood. The owner is apparently motivated to sell quickly. $800,000? In that area? That does sound like a good deal. Who's the listing agent? I gave her the name Charlotte had provided. I should mention, I used to live next door to this property. If you'd like, I could meet you there and give you some insight into the neighborhood. The history of the house, what the neighbors are like, that sort of thing. That would be wonderful. When would be good for you? We arranged to meet the following Saturday for a showing. As I hung up the phone, I felt the first real smile cross my face since Richard's death. It wasn't much of a plan yet, but it was a beginning. Bradley wanted to erase me from his father's life, to pretend I never existed. But he'd forgotten something important. I'd been a research librarian for 20 years. I knew how to find information, how to piece together stories from scattered clues, how to uncover truths that people wanted to keep hidden. And more than that, I'd been married to a history professor who taught me that the present was always shaped by the past, that understanding someone's story was the key to predicting their future behavior. Bradley thought he was writing the final chapter of his story.
But he was wrong about that too.
The story was just beginning, and he wasn't going to like how it ended. I spent the rest of the week preparing for Saturday's house showing, researching Kathy's business, and planning exactly what I would tell her about my former home and its current owner. Knowledge was power, and I intended to be very powerful indeed. The game was about to begin in earnest. Saturday morning dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of autumn light that made even ordinary houses look like magazine spreads. I dressed carefully for my meeting with Kathy, casual but polished, the kind of outfit that suggested a reliable neighbor with good judgment and nothing to hide. I arrived at the house 15 minutes early and parked down the street where I could watch without being obvious. It felt strange, seeing my former home from this perspective, as if I were a stranger evaluating a potential purchase rather than someone who'd lived there for 15 years. Bradley had clearly been busy. The lawn was immaculately manicured, the flower beds weeded and mulched, the windows sparkling clean. He'd even had the exterior painted, a warm gray that complemented the stone foundation and made the house look both classic and contemporary. I had to admit, it looked good. But then, Bradley had always been skilled at creating attractive surfaces that concealed uglier truths beneath. Kathy arrived precisely on time, driving a silver BMW that managed to look both expensive and practical. She was in her mid-40s, with the kind of confident energy that suggested someone who'd built her success through competence rather than connections. I'd chosen well. "Margot," she called out as she approached.
"It's so good to see you again."
"You look wonderful, considering." "Thank you. Grief is, well, it's a process. But keeping busy helps." "I'm sure it does. Now, tell me about this house. The listing photos look amazing, but there's always more to the story than what you see online." As we walked up the front path, I launched into the persona I'd carefully crafted, the friendly former neighbor who'd happened to hear about a good deal and wanted to share the information. It was important to seem helpful but not too invested, knowledgeable but not suspiciously so. "The house was built in 1994, I said, "so it's got good bones but with modern conveniences." The owner before last was a philosophy professor, very meticulous about maintenance. He updated all the major systems about 5 years ago. "And the current owner?" "Bradley Delaney. He inherited it from his father, but I don't think he's really interested in living here. He seems to want a quick sale." I paused, as if considering whether to say more. "Between you and me, I think he might be having some financial difficulties. I've heard rumors about his business ventures." Kathy's real estate instincts sharpened immediately. "What kind of rumors?" "Oh, you know how people talk. Something about problems with his development projects, investors pulling out. It might not be true, but it would explain why the price is so aggressive for this neighborhood." The listing agent arrived just as we reached the front door. A young man in an expensive suit who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He introduced himself as Mike something or other and immediately launched into a generic sales pitch about square footage and recent improvements. But as we toured the house, I could see Kathy's attention was focused on details that the agent either didn't know or was deliberately avoiding. The water damage in the basement that had been painted over rather than properly repaired. The foundation crack that had been cosmetically filled, but not structurally addressed. The electrical panel that was older than the listing claimed and probably needed updating. "How long has the current owner lived here?" Kathy asked as we examined the kitchen. "Oh, Mr. Delaney doesn't actually live here," the agent said quickly. "He's been using it as an investment property." I raised an eyebrow. Investment property? I thought he inherited it from his father just a few weeks ago. The agent's face flushed slightly. Well, yes, he's considering it as an investment opportunity going forward. Kathy and I exchanged glances. She was clearly catching the same inconsistencies I was, but from a professional rather than personal perspective, which was perfect. It meant she'd ask the hard questions without me having to prompt her. Has the property been rented?
Kathy asked.
Are there any existing tenant agreements I should know about?
No, no tenants.
It's been vacant. Since when? The agent checked his notes, clearly uncomfortable. Since early September. That's interesting, I said innocently. I could have sworn I saw lights on in the evenings through most of September. Maybe someone was house-sitting. I'm not sure about the details. You'd have to ask Mr. Delaney directly. As we moved through the house, I found myself seeing it with new eyes. This had been my home, the place where Richard and I had built our life together. But Bradley had already begun erasing traces of that life. Our wedding photos were gone from the mantelpiece. The books that had filled Richard's study had been boxed up and removed. Even small personal touches, the throw pillows I'd chosen for the living room, the artwork we'd collected during our travels, had disappeared. It was as if the house had been stripped of its soul, turned into a generic showplace that could appeal to any buyer. But in his haste to erase us, Bradley had also erased any sense of warmth or personality that might have made a buyer fall in love with the property. The house feels a bit cold, doesn't it? Kathy murmured as we examined the master bedroom. It does, I agreed. It's beautifully maintained, but it lacks, I don't know, character? Like someone took a beautiful home and turned it into a hotel room.
Exactly.
And at this price point, buyers expect more than just square footage. They want to be able to envision themselves living here, creating memories. The agent was growing increasingly nervous as Kathy's questions became more pointed. Why was the owner so eager to sell? Had there been other offers? Were there any easements or deed restrictions? Had the property ever been used for commercial purposes? Each question revealed more inconsistencies in Bradley's story, more gaps in the agent's knowledge. It was becoming clear that Bradley had been less than forthcoming about the property's history and his own motivations for selling. After we'd seen the entire house, Kathy and I stood in the driveway while the agent retreated to his car to make some calls. What do you think? I asked. Honestly, something doesn't add up. The price is too good, the owner's story keeps changing, and that agent knows less about the property than he should. Kathy shook her head. In my experience, when a deal looks too good to be true, it usually is. Maybe the owner really is just desperate to sell? Maybe. But desperation makes me nervous. What if there are liens against the property? What if he doesn't actually have clear title? What if there are environmental issues or zoning problems he's not disclosing? I nodded thoughtfully. Those are good points. Is there a way to find out more about the owner's situation? Publicly available information, I mean? Absolutely. I always do due diligence on properties that seem unusual. Property records, tax liens, court filings, it's all public information if you know where to look. Would you mind sharing what you find? I have to admit, I'm curious now. And if there are problems with the property, the other neighbors should probably know. Kathy agreed, and we exchanged contact information. As I drove away from the house, I felt a deep satisfaction. The seed had been planted. Kathy would do her research, discover the irregularities in Bradley's ownership claims, and inevitably uncover the broader pattern of his fraudulent business dealings. But more than that, I'd begun to understand something important about Bradley's psychology. In his eagerness to erase Richard and me from the house, he'd also erased everything that made it special. He saw the property only as a financial asset, not as a home where real people had lived and loved and built a life together. That emotional blindness would be his downfall. Over the next few days, I put the second phase of my plan into motion. Using the landline and a carefully disguised voice, I began making anonymous complaints to various government agencies. To the zoning board, I'm concerned about the property ad address. The owner claims it's been an investment property, but I believe someone was living there as recently as last month. Are there any permit violations we should know about? To the HOA, there have been some irregularities with one of the properties in our neighborhood. Potential deed fraud. You might want to look into the ownership history of address. To the IRS tip line, I have reason to believe that Bradley Delaney has been claiming properties as primary residences for tax purposes when he's actually been flipping them as investments. You might want to audit his last few years of returns. Each call was brief, professional, and carefully calculated to trigger official scrutiny without revealing my identity. I'd learned during my years as a librarian that government agencies were often overworked and understaffed, but they took anonymous tips seriously when those tips came with specific addresses and verifiable claims. Charlotte called on Wednesday with an update. "Your friend Kathy is very thorough," she said approvingly. "She's been asking all the right questions about the property records. And her questions have apparently made their way back to Bradley." "How do you know?" "Because he called me yesterday, furious about harassment from potential buyers. Apparently, he's getting questions he can't answer about the property's history and his legal right to sell it." "What did you tell him?" "Nothing. I told him that as far as I knew, you disappeared and I had no idea where you were." "Which is technically true. I don't know exactly where you are, just that you're somewhere safe." "Is he suspicious?" "Oh, he's paranoid. But not about the right things. He's convinced that you're hiding somewhere, plotting some kind of legal challenge to the will. He has no idea that the will has already been changed, or that every day he continues this charade, he's digging himself deeper into criminal liability." That night, I implemented the third phase of my plan. Using the skills I developed over 20 years of research work, I began creating an online presence for the house that Bradley was trying to sell. But not the kind of presence he wanted. I started with the ghost hunter forums. There were dozens of them online, communities of people who were absolutely convinced that certain properties were haunted and who took perverse pleasure in documenting supernatural activity. They were also remarkably gullible and prone to spreading stories without verification. Using a throwaway email account, I posted a carefully crafted story about the Delaney haunting, a supposedly cursed property where the ghost of a wronged woman could sometimes be heard crying from within the walls. I included just enough verifiable details about the house's layout and neighborhood to make the story seem credible, while adding fictional elements about mysterious sounds, cold spots, and electronic equipment malfunctioning. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Within hours, my post had been shared across multiple forums and social media groups. Ghost hunters began making plans to visit the property. Local paranormal investigation groups started discussing the Delaney house as a potential case study. But the real genius of the plan wasn't the ghost hunters themselves. It was their tendency to broadcast everything on social media. By Thursday evening, TikTok videos were already appearing with teenagers standing outside my former home, claiming to detect spiritual energy and negative vibes. Instagram posts tagged the location with hashtag haunted house and hashtag Delaney ghost. The neighborhood was in chaos. Parents were calling each other, worried about strange teenagers lurking around with cameras and electromagnetic field detectors. The HOA was fielding complaints about noise and trespassing, and Bradley was caught completely off guard by a problem he couldn't understand or control. Charlotte called again on Friday, barely able to contain her laughter. "Margot, what did you do?" "Bradley is beside himself. Apparently, there are ghost hunters camping out in front of the house with sage sticks and EMF detectors. 3 separate showings have been canceled because the buyers were spooked by teenagers with cameras talking about supernatural activity. I may have shared some local folklore about the property. I said innocently. Local folklore that you invented? The internet is full of stories, Charlotte. Sometimes they take on a life of their own. You magnificent, devious woman. I'm beginning to think Richard married someone even more brilliant than he realized. As I hung up the phone, I allowed myself a moment of pure satisfaction. Bradley had thought he could erase me from the story, make me disappear without a trace. But he'd forgotten that I was a storyteller by profession, someone who understood the power of narrative to shape reality. I wasn't disappearing. I was becoming the ghost that would haunt his dreams. And this was just the beginning. By the weekend, the ghost hunter invasion had reached epic proportions. What had started as a few curious teenagers with smartphones had evolved into a full-scale paranormal investigation community descended upon my former neighborhood like locusts with electromagnetic field detectors. I drove by on Saturday evening, parking several blocks away and walking through the adjacent subdivision to get a better view. The scene was surreal. At least a dozen cars were parked along the street, filled with people of all ages armed with cameras, recording equipment, and various pseudoscientific gadgets designed to detect spiritual energy. A group of college-aged kids had set up what appeared to be a base camp on the sidewalk across from the house, complete with folding chairs, coolers, and a whiteboard where they were documenting paranormal events by time and location. An older couple was slowly walking the perimeter of the property with some kind of device that beeped intermittently, causing them to whisper excitedly and make notes. Most amusing of all was a teenage girl with purple hair who was live streaming to what appeared to be several hundred viewers, providing breathless commentary about the spiritual disturbance she claimed to be sensing. "Can you feel that?" she was saying to her phone camera. "There's definitely something here. Something angry. Something that doesn't want to be forgotten." I had to admit, she wasn't wrong about the angry part. The house itself looked like a crime scene. Bradley had posted no trespassing signs all around the property, but that hadn't stopped the more determined investigators from leaving offerings on the porch, flowers, candles, handwritten notes expressing sympathy for the restless spirit they believed inhabited the house. I was documenting the scene with my own phone when I spotted a familiar figure emerging from the house. Bradley himself, looking absolutely livid as he stormed toward the assembled crowd. "This is private property," he shouted, waving what appeared to be a legal document. "I will call the police if you don't disperse immediately." The ghost hunters looked up with interest, but showed no signs of leaving. In fact, Bradley's obvious distress seemed to energize them, as if his anger was confirmation that they were onto something significant. "Sir," called out the older man with the beeping device, "we're not on your property. We're on the public sidewalk, which is perfectly legal. We're just documenting unusual electromagnetic signatures in the area." "There are no electromagnetic signatures," Bradley screamed. "This is a normal house. There are no ghosts." "That's exactly what someone would say if they were trying to cover up a haunting," the purple-haired girl said to her camera. "Notice how defensive he's getting? Classic guilt behavior." I watched Bradley's face cycle through rage, frustration, and something approaching panic as he realized that his protests were only making the situation worse. Everything he said was being recorded, broadcast live, and interpreted as evidence of the very supernatural activity he was trying to debunk. Finally, he stormed back into the house and slammed the door. Within minutes, police cars arrived. Clearly, he'd made good on his threat to call for help. But the police were remarkably unhelpful from Bradley's perspective. After confirming that the ghost hunters were indeed on public property and weren't disturbing the peace, the officers essentially shrugged and left. There was nothing illegal about people standing on a sidewalk with cameras, even if their reasons for being there were unusual. I watched the scene for another hour, taking notes and photos that I planned to share with Charlotte. The ghost hunter community was self-perpetuating now. The more attention the house received, the more people heard about it and wanted to investigate for themselves. Bradley had created a problem that would be almost impossible to solve through conventional means. But the real beauty of the situation wasn't the immediate chaos. It was the long-term implications for his ability to sell the property. What buyer was going to want to purchase a house that was famous on social media as a haunted property? What mortgage company would approve a loan for a property that had become a tourist destination for paranormal investigators? I'd turned his most valuable asset into an unsellable liability, and I'd done it using nothing but stories and the internet's endless appetite for supernatural drama. Charlotte called me that evening, practically breathless with excitement. "Margot, you're a genius. A completely ruthless, brilliant genius. Do you know that videos of the house have been viewed over 1 million times in the last 3 days?" I hadn't checked the numbers. Well, I have. And so has Bradley, apparently. His real estate agent called him this afternoon to suggest taking the house off the market until the negative publicity dies down. How do you know that? Because Bradley called me absolutely hysterical, demanding to know if you were somehow behind the ghost stories. I told him truthfully that I had no idea what he was talking about, since I don't know anything about your social media activities. What did he say to that? He said he was going to find you and make you stop this campaign of harassment. Which is interesting because it suggests he knows perfectly well that the ghost stories are fabricated. But he can't prove I'm behind them? Not unless he wants to admit publicly that the haunted house stories are fake, which would require him to acknowledge that he knows more about the property's history than he's been claiming. I smiled in the darkness of the trailer. Bradley was caught in a perfect trap of his own making. To debunk the ghost stories, he'd have to reveal knowledge about the house that contradicted his claims about being an absentee inheritor. But to maintain his cover story, he'd have to let the supernatural narrative continue to damage the property's marketability. "Charlotte, there's something else I want to try. But I'll need your help to make it look authentic." "What kind of help?" "The kind that might require you to compromise your professional ethics, just a tiny bit." "Margot, after watching what Bradley has done to you, I'm prepared to compromise my ethics quite a lot. What do you need?" Over the next hour, I outlined the next phase of my plan. It was more complex than the ghost stories, requiring careful timing and Charlotte's knowledge of real estate law. But if it worked, it would create problems for Bradley that went far beyond supernatural tourism. "You want me to file complaints about the property based on information you're going to plant?" Charlotte asked. "Not plant. Uncover. There's a difference." "A legal difference?" "A moral difference. Which is what matters." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. "Margot, I have to ask, are you sure you want to go this far? What you're describing isn't just pranks anymore. This could seriously damage Bradley's ability to make a living." I thought about the question seriously. A month ago, I would have been horrified by what I was planning. The old Margot, the accommodating librarian who'd spent her life avoiding conflict, would never have considered such an elaborate revenge scheme. But that woman had died the day Bradley told her she was never really family. What had emerged from that death was someone harder, smarter, and completely unwilling to be erased without a fight. "Charlotte, Bradley destroyed my home, stole my inheritance, and tried to erase 15 years of marriage as if they never happened. He did it casually, cruelly, and without a moment's remorse. So yes, I'm sure." "In that case," Charlotte said, "let's destroy him." The next phase of my plan required getting inside the house, which was considerably more challenging now that Bradley had installed security cameras and posted trespassing warnings. But I had advantages that the ghost hunters didn't. I knew the property intimately, including details that wouldn't appear on any surveillance footage. Richard and I had hidden a spare key years ago, buried in a waterproof container beneath the third stepping stone in the garden path. It was our little secret, a backup plan for the times when one of us got locked out while working in the yard. Bradley had never known about it, and in his rush to sanitize the property for sale, he'd overlooked this small detail. I waited until Tuesday evening, when the ghost hunter activity had died down to just a few dedicated investigators with night vision cameras. Using skills I'd learned during childhood summers at my grandfather's farm, I approached the house through the woods behind the property, staying low and moving slowly to avoid triggering any motion sensors Bradley might have installed. The spare key was exactly where we'd left it, buried beneath the stepping stone and wrapped in the same plastic bag Richard had used to protect it from moisture. For a moment, holding that key in my hand, I felt the full weight of what I was about to do. This had been my home, the place where I'd been happiest. Now I was breaking into it like a thief. But Bradley had made it clear that I no longer had any right to be here. If he wanted to treat me like a criminal, then perhaps it was time to oblige him. The house was dark and eerily quiet as I slipped through the back door. Bradley had clearly been staying elsewhere, probably at his apartment in the city, which made my mission much easier. I had several hours to work without fear of discovery. I'd come prepared with supplies that I'd purchased using cash at stores far from my current location, several cans of sardines, a few packages of Limburger cheese, and some particularly pungent fish sauce that I'd found at an Asian grocery store. My plan was simple but effective. Hide these aromatic items in places where they would decompose slowly and create persistent, unpleasant odors that would be difficult to locate and eliminate. The beauty of the scheme was its subtlety. The smells would develop gradually over several days, becoming stronger and more noticeable, but not immediately obvious as sabotage. Potential buyers would notice an unpleasant odor but wouldn't necessarily be able to identify its source. Real estate agents would be baffled by a problem that seemed to have no clear solution. I started in the basement, opening several cans of sardines and pouring the contents into the HVAC system's return air vents. The smell would be distributed throughout the house every time the heating or cooling system ran, but the source would be hidden inside the ductwork where it would be almost impossible to find without dismantling the entire system. Next, I went to the kitchen and hid packages of Limburger cheese inside the cabinet beneath the sink, tucked behind the garbage disposal where they wouldn't be immediately visible, but where heat from the pipes would accelerate their decomposition. I repeated this process in several other locations, behind the water heater, inside the hall closet near the furnace, even inside the master bedroom's walk-in closet where the heat from the adjacent bathroom would create perfect conditions for aromatic decay. The fish sauce was my masterstroke. I diluted it with water and used a small spray bottle to apply it to hidden surfaces throughout the house, the undersides of furniture, the backs of radiators, inside closets and cabinets. It would dry quickly and be virtually invisible, but it would release a persistent, unpleasant odor that would be impossible to eliminate without knowing exactly where to look. The entire operation took less than 2 hours. When I was finished, the house still smelled normal. The aromatic compounds needed time to develop and spread. But within a few days, the property would be uninhabitable for anyone with a functioning sense of smell. I let myself out through the same back door and made my way back to my car through the woods, feeling a deep satisfaction at a job well done. Bradley thought he could control this situation through conventional means, lawyers, real estate agents, security cameras. But he'd forgotten that some problems couldn't be solved with money or legal threats. Charlotte called me the next evening with the first reports from the field. "How's the ghost hunter situation?" I asked. "Oh, they're still there. But that's not why I'm calling. I just heard from Kathy Riddle. She went back to look at the house again today. Apparently, she's still interested despite the paranormal tourism, and she said something very interesting." Which was? She said the house had a strange smell. Nothing overwhelming, but definitely noticeable. Sort of a fishy, unpleasant odor that she couldn't quite identify. That is interesting. Did she mention it to the listing agent?
She did.
And apparently, he was completely baffled. He claimed the house had been professionally cleaned just last week and that there shouldn't be any odors at all. Maybe it's connected to the supernatural activity, I suggested innocently. Don't some people believe that ghosts can cause unusual smells? Margot, you are absolutely diabolical. I love it. Over the next few days, the reports became more frequent and more dramatic. The smell was getting stronger, spreading throughout the house, and becoming impossible to ignore. 2 separate showings were cut short when potential buyers complained about the odor. The listing agent brought in a professional cleaning crew, but they couldn't identify the source of the problem. Bradley was beside himself. According to Charlotte's sources, he'd spent an entire day at the house with air fresheners, fans, and industrial-grade cleaning supplies, trying desperately to eliminate a smell that seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The ghost hunter community, predictably, had their own theories about the mysterious odor. Videos began appearing online suggesting that the smell was supernatural in origin, the scent of decay associated with restless spirits, or perhaps the ghost's way of expressing her displeasure with attempts to sell her former home. It's definitely getting stronger, the purple-haired girl reported to her live stream audience. And it's not like any smell I've ever encountered in a normal house. This is something otherworldly, something that doesn't want to be ignored. By the end of the week, Bradley had hired 3 different professional cleaning services, 2 HVAC specialists, and even a company that specialized in odor elimination. None of them could identify the source of the problem or provide a permanent solution. The house was becoming unsellable for multiple reasons now. The ghost stories had damaged its reputation and attracted unwanted attention. The mysterious smell made it physically unpleasant to spend time inside. And the combination of these problems was creating a feedback loop that made each issue worse. But the real victory wasn't the immediate chaos I was causing. It was the way these problems were revealing Bradley's fundamental character flaws to everyone around him. His anger, his desperation, his complete inability to handle unexpected challenges. All of it was on display for potential buyers, real estate professionals, and neighbors to see. He was demolishing his own credibility more effectively than I ever could have managed alone. Charlotte called me on Saturday with the week's final update. The listing agent wants to withdraw the house from the market, she reported. He says it's become a liability for his company's reputation. Between the ghost hunters and the smell, he can't show the property to serious buyers anymore. What did Bradley say to that? He threatened to sue for breach of contract. But here's the beautiful part. The listing agreement includes a clause that allows the agent to withdraw if the property becomes unsellable due to factors beyond his control. Supernatural tourism and mysterious odors definitely qualify. So, the house is off the market? Effectively, yes. Bradley can try to find another agent, but word travels fast in the real estate community. No one is going to want to take on a property with this kind of baggage. As I hung up the phone, I felt a deep sense of accomplishment. In less than a month, I'd transformed Bradley's most valuable asset from a desirable property worth over $1 million into a liability that no one wanted to touch. But this was still just the beginning. The house was only one part of Bradley's life, and I had plans for all the others. It was time to expand my campaign beyond real estate and into the realm of public reputation. Bradley cared deeply about his image as a successful businessman and respected member of the community. Soon, he would discover just how fragile that image really was. While Bradley was dealing with ghost hunters and mysterious smells, I was busy researching the broader landscape of his business dealings. 20 years as a research librarian had taught me that information was everywhere if you knew how to look for it, and Bradley had left a surprisingly extensive digital footprint for someone who thought himself clever. Public records revealed a pattern of questionable real estate transactions going back nearly a decade. Properties purchased and flipped within months, often with loans that claimed they were primary residences when county records showed Bradley had never changed his address. Tax assessments that mysteriously decreased just before sales, then returned to normal valuations under new ownership. Insurance claims for properties he'd owned for suspiciously short periods. But the real breakthrough came when I discovered that Bradley had been featured in a local podcast about real estate investing the previous year. In his eagerness to promote himself as a successful entrepreneur, he'd been remarkably candid about his methods for maximizing profits and minimizing taxes. The podcast was called Connecticut Real Estate Insider, and the episode featuring Bradley was titled Creative Financing Strategies for the Modern Investor. As I listened to the 40-minute interview, I couldn't believe how openly he discussed techniques that skirted the edge of legality. The key is understanding how to work within the system, Bradley had explained to the host. For example, if you claim a property as your primary residence, you can get much better loan terms, even if you're planning to flip it immediately. And there are ways to structure the timing of purchases and sales to minimize your tax burden. Can you give us some specific examples? The host had asked. Well, hypothetically speaking, you might purchase a property in December and claim it as your primary residence for tax purposes, then sell it in March as an investment property. The IRS doesn't always catch those kinds of timeline issues, especially on smaller transactions. He'd gone on to describe other creative strategies, backdating purchase agreements to avoid capital gains taxes, using shell companies to hide the true ownership of properties, even claiming repairs and improvements that had never actually been made. It was a masterclass in real estate fraud, delivered with the casual confidence of someone who'd never faced serious consequences for his actions. I made careful notes and saved digital copies of the podcast to multiple cloud storage accounts. Then I began researching the host and the podcast's audience, looking for the best way to ensure that Bradley's admissions reached the right people. The podcast host, it turned out, was a licensed real estate agent himself, someone who would be ethically obligated to report suspected fraud to the appropriate authorities. The podcast also had a significant following among real estate professionals, including agents, investors, and regulatory officials who would recognize the legal implications of Bradley's statements. Using an anonymous email account, I sent a carefully crafted message to the podcast host. Dear Mr. Rodriguez, I recently listened to your episode featuring Bradley Delaney and his creative financing strategies. As a concerned citizen and real estate professional, I felt compelled to bring to your attention that many of the techniques Mr. Delaney described appear to constitute fraud under Connecticut state law and federal tax regulations. I've done some research into Mr. Delaney's actual business practices, and there appear to be significant discrepancies between his public statements and his documented transactions. You might want to consider whether your platform should be promoting techniques that could expose your listeners to criminal liability. I've attached some publicly available documents that raise questions about Mr. Delaney's credibility and business practices. You may want to consult with your legal team about the potential implications of having featured him so prominently. A concerned listener. I attached selected excerpts from the public records I'd compiled, carefully choosing documents that raised obvious red flags without revealing how extensively I'd researched Bradley's activities. The response was swift and decisive. Within 48 hours, the podcast episode had been removed from all platforms with a brief statement. Upon further review, we have determined that content in this episode may not meet our editorial standards. We apologize for any confusion and are reviewing our guest vetting procedures. But removing the episode only drew more attention to it. Real estate professionals who had heard it began discussing it on industry forums, speculating about what content had been so problematic that it required complete removal. Someone had apparently saved a copy of the episode and was sharing it privately, along with increasingly detailed analyses of Bradley's statements and their legal implications. Charlotte called me with updates as the story spread through Connecticut's real estate community. It's like watching a slow-motion avalanche, she reported. Everyone in the industry is talking about Bradley now, and none of it is good. 2 different agents have told me they've been contacted by investigators asking about his business practices. What kind of investigators? State regulatory officials, IRS, possibly FBI. When someone publicly describes multiple federal crimes in a podcast interview, it tends to attract official attention. How is Bradley handling it? Not well. He's been calling around trying to find out who reported him, threatening to sue for defamation. But you can't defame someone by quoting their own words back to them. The investigation moved quickly once it began. Bradley's financial records were subpoenaed, his properties were examined for evidence of fraud, and his business associates were interviewed about their knowledge of his activities. It turned out that Bradley had been even more reckless than I'd suspected. He'd been using the same fraudulent techniques for years, confident that his activities were too small-scale to attract attention from overwhelmed regulatory agencies. But once investigators began looking closely at his transactions, they found a pattern of systematic fraud that stretched back to the beginning of his real estate career. The house that he was trying to sell illegally was just the tip of the iceberg. Investigators discovered loan fraud on at least 6 different properties, claiming primary residence status for properties he'd never lived in. Tax fraud through backdated purchase agreements and false depreciation claims. Insurance fraud through suspicious damage claims on properties he'd owned for short periods. Money laundering through shell companies that existed only on paper. Each discovery led to new questions, new subpoenas, new evidence of criminal activity. Bradley had built his entire business model on fraud, and now that structure was collapsing under the weight of official scrutiny. But the most devastating blow came when investigators traced his recent activities and discovered that he'd been trying to sell property he didn't legally own. The house that had started this entire investigation, my house, became the centerpiece of a major fraud case. Charlotte delivered the news with barely contained glee. Bradley has been arrested, she announced. Multiple counts of fraud, grand theft, and conspiracy. The prosecutor is calling it one of the most extensive real estate fraud schemes they've seen in Connecticut. What about the house? Seized as evidence. It's tied up in litigation now, which means Bradley can't sell it, can't profit from it, and can't use it as collateral for legal fees. I felt a deep sense of satisfaction at this news, but also something unexpected. Pity. Not for Bradley, he'd earned every consequence he was facing. But for the life he'd thrown away through greed and arrogance, for the relationships he'd destroyed in pursuit of money that was never really his. Charlotte, how long could he face in prison? If convicted on all counts? 20 to 30 years. Real estate fraud is a federal crime, and he's been doing it systematically for almost a decade. Plus, there are state charges for the theft of your properties specifically. 20 to 30 years. Bradley would be in his 60s when he got out, his business destroyed, his reputation ruined, his inheritance spent on legal fees and restitution. He tried to erase me from the story, but instead, he'd erased himself. That evening, as I sat in the trailer watching the sun set through the trees, I reflected on how completely the situation had reversed itself. A month ago, Bradley had called to inform me that I was homeless and powerless, that I had no family and no future. Now he was the one facing homelessness, sitting in a jail cell waiting for a bail hearing he probably couldn't afford. His business was destroyed, his assets were frozen, and his reputation was in ruins. Meanwhile, I was about to inherit everything he'd tried to steal, plus compensation for the emotional distress he'd caused. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was a number I didn't recognize, but something made me answer it. Margot? This is Bradley. His voice was different now, smaller, frightened, stripped of the arrogance that had defined our every interaction for 15 years. He sounded like what he actually was, a scared man who'd finally been caught. Hello, Bradley. I'm calling from jail. They gave me one phone call, and I didn't know who else to call. The irony was almost too perfect. After 15 years of treating me like an unwanted intruder, after telling me I was never really family, after trying to steal my inheritance and erase my marriage, he was calling me for help because I was the only person left in his life who might still care enough to take his call. What do you want, Bradley?
I'm sorry.
The words came out in a rush, desperate and defeated.
I'm so sorry, Margot.
I was wrong about everything. I was angry and stupid, and I thought I deserved more than I did. I thought you were taking something away from me, but you weren't. You made Dad happy. You were good for him. And I destroyed everything because I couldn't see past my own selfishness. Yes, you did. Is there any way you could help me? With bail or a lawyer, or just tell people that I'm not completely evil? I know I don't deserve it, but I don't know what else to do. I was quiet for a long moment, considering his request. A month ago, I would have said yes immediately. The old Margot, the accommodating one who always tried to keep the peace, would have found a way to help him despite everything he'd done. But that woman was gone, and the person who'd replaced her understood something important. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let someone face the full consequences of their choices.
No, Bradley.
I can't help you. Margot, please. You made your choices. You chose cruelty over kindness, greed over family, fraud over honest work. And now you get to live with those choices. But I'm sorry. I said I was sorry. I know you are. You're sorry you got caught. You're sorry you're facing consequences. You're sorry your plan didn't work. But you're not sorry for what you did to me, not really. You're just sorry it didn't turn out the way you wanted. That's not true. Yes, it is. If your plan had worked, if you'd successfully stolen my inheritance and made me disappear, you'd be celebrating right now instead of calling me for help. I could hear him crying on the other end of the line, but I felt nothing. No sympathy, no urge to comfort him, no desire to make his pain go away. He'd forfeited any claim on my compassion the day he told me I was never really family. Goodbye, Bradley. I hope you get the help you need in prison. I hope you learn to be a better person. But I won't be part of that process. I hung up the phone and turned it off, then sat in the gathering darkness thinking about justice and revenge and the difference between the two. Justice was Bradley facing legal consequences for his crimes. Revenge was the satisfaction I felt knowing that his own choices had destroyed him more completely than I ever could have managed alone. But the sweetest victory wasn't his downfall. It was the knowledge that I'd survived his attempt to erase me, that I'd found strength I didn't know I possessed, and that I'd honored Richard's memory by refusing to disappear quietly. I was still here. I was still Margot Delaney. And I was stronger than I'd ever been before. The next morning brought a call from Charlotte with news that felt like the final piece of a complex puzzle clicking into place. Margot, we need to meet.
Today.
I have the final documentation from Richard's estate, and it's time to make everything official. I drove to Charlotte's office in town, my first venture into public since I'd begun this campaign of quiet destruction. It felt strange to be among people again, to sit in a professional waiting room surrounded by the ordinary concerns of wills and property transfers and legal disputes that had nothing to do with revenge or justice or the systematic demolition of someone's life. Charlotte's office was exactly what I'd expected: leather-bound law books, mahogany furniture, diplomas, and awards arranged with careful precision on paneled walls. But Charlotte herself looked different than I'd ever seen her. There was something almost predatory in her satisfaction, a sense of professional triumph that went beyond winning a typical case. Bradley's arrest has changed everything, she said, settling behind her massive desk with a stack of legal documents. Not just for the criminal charges, but for the civil case. When someone is arrested for fraud related to your property, it significantly strengthens our position. How so? It validates everything we've been claiming about his illegal activities. The court can't ignore criminal charges when making decisions about civil matters. More importantly, it means we can pursue enhanced damages for emotional distress and punitive measures. Charlotte opened the first folder and spread documents across her desk like a winning poker hand. Here's what we have now. The original will leaving everything to Bradley, The codicil that changes the distribution to give you 75%, proof that Bradley knew about the codicil and chose to ignore it, evidence that he committed multiple felonies in attempting to steal your inheritance, and documentation of the emotional and financial damage he caused. What does that mean in practical terms? It means you get everything, Margot. Not just the 75% that Richard intended, but Bradley's 25% as well, forfeited due to his criminal actions. The house, the investments, the life insurance, all of it. I stared at the documents, trying to process what she was telling me. All of it. All of it. Plus damages for the emotional distress he caused, plus compensation for the diminished value of the house due to his fraudulent activities and the subsequent, unusual circumstances that made it temporarily unsellable. The ghost stories. The smell. The circus of paranormal investigators. Charlotte was including all of it in our legal strategy, treating Bradley's victims as evidence of the damage he'd caused to the property's marketability. But there's more, Charlotte continued, her smile becoming absolutely vicious. Because Bradley was arrested while actively attempting to defraud you, the court is treating this as an ongoing criminal enterprise. That means all of his assets, including properties he acquired through previous fraudulent activities, are subject to forfeiture and restitution. What does that mean? It means you're about to become a very wealthy woman. Bradley's real estate portfolio is worth approximately $3.2 million. His investment accounts contain another $800,000. And because he used fraudulent means to acquire most of it, the court can order all of it transferred to his victims as restitution. I felt dizzy. When this had started, I'd simply wanted to keep my home and maintain some dignity in the face of Bradley's cruelty. Now Charlotte was telling me that I was about to receive assets worth over $4 million. That seems like too much, I said slowly. Margot, this isn't charity. This is justice. Bradley built his wealth through systematic fraud over nearly a decade. His victims deserve compensation, and since you're the primary victim of his most recent and extensive fraud scheme, you're entitled to the largest share of restitution. Charlotte pulled out another document, this one with official seals and signatures. This is the court order freezing Bradley's assets pending the outcome of his criminal trial. But we don't have to wait for that trial to resolve the civil matters. We can file for immediate restitution based on the criminal charges already filed. How long will that take? Given the overwhelming evidence and Bradley's arrest, probably 6 to 8 weeks. The court wants to resolve civil matters quickly when there are clear criminal violations involved. I thought about Bradley sitting in his jail cell, probably still hoping that somehow he could salvage his situation through legal maneuvering or plea bargaining. He had no idea that while he'd been busy trying to steal my inheritance, I'd been systematically documenting every aspect of his criminal enterprise and building a case that would destroy him completely. Charlotte, there's something I need to tell you about how we discovered some of Bradley's irregularities. I explained about the ghost stories, the smells, the social media campaign that had attracted enough attention to derail his house sale and create an opening for deeper investigation. Charlotte listened with growing amazement and what appeared to be professional admiration. Margot, that's brilliant. Completely insane, but brilliant. You created a problem that forced him to reveal his true character while simultaneously making his stolen property unsellable. Is any of it illegal? What I did, I mean? Which part? The ghost stories are protected speech. You never claimed they were factual, just shared folklore and let other people draw their own conclusions. The social media posts were made by other people based on stories they heard from unknown sources. And as for the smells, Charlotte grinned wickedly. You broke into your own house, or rather, a house that you legally own and that Bradley was fraudulently trying to sell. Any vandalism you committed was to your own property. The fact that it made the house temporarily uninhabitable was just an unfortunate coincidence. So, I'm not going to be arrested too? For what? Being creative and protecting your own interests? For using social media to share local stories? For exercising your legal right to access property that belongs to you? Charlotte shook her head. Bradley might suspect you were behind some of his problems, but he can't prove anything, and even if he could, most of what you did was perfectly legal. She gathered the documents back into neat stacks and locked them in her safe. Margot, I want you to understand something. What you've accomplished here goes beyond just getting your inheritance back. You've exposed a criminal enterprise that was victimizing other people. You've ensured that Bradley will face serious consequences for his crimes. And you've done it all while maintaining your own legal and ethical integrity. It doesn't feel ethical. It feels like revenge. Sometimes revenge and justice are the same thing. Bradley made a choice to try to destroy you, to erase your marriage, and steal your future. You made a choice to fight back intelligently and systematically. The fact that his own actions provided the rope he used to hang himself just proves that karma sometimes needs a little help from clever people. As I drove back to the trailer that afternoon, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this point. 2 months ago, I'd been a grieving widow who thought her biggest challenge was learning to live alone. Now I was about to become a millionaire several times over, the primary beneficiary of a court-ordered asset forfeiture that would destroy the man who'd tried to destroy me. But the money wasn't the real victory. The real victory was that I'd survived Bradley's attempt to erase me. I'd refused to disappear quietly, refused to accept his narrative about my worth and my place in the family. I'd fought back using intelligence and creativity and patience, and I'd won. More than that, I discovered parts of myself I'd never known existed. The quiet librarian who'd spent her life avoiding conflict had turned out to be capable of sophisticated strategic thinking and ruthless execution when protecting something that mattered. Richard would have been proud, I thought. Not of the revenge itself, perhaps, but of the strength I'd found, the refusal to be diminished by someone else's cruelty. He'd always believed I was stronger than I knew. It had just taken Bradley's betrayal to prove him right. The phone rang as I was preparing dinner in the trailer's tiny kitchen. It was Charlotte calling with one final update. I just heard from the prosecutor's office. Bradley tried to make a deal. He offered to plead guilty to reduce charges in exchange for keeping 50% of his assets to pay for his legal defense. What did they say? They laughed. Literally laughed. The evidence against him is so overwhelming that they don't need his cooperation, and the victim's rights advocate pointed out that any deal that left him with substantial assets would be fundamentally unjust to his victims. So no deal? No deal. Bradley is going to trial, he's going to be convicted, and he's going to lose everything. The prosecutor estimates he'll get 15 to 20 years in federal prison, followed by several more years for the state charges. I felt a deep sense of completion at this news. The circle was closing, justice was being served, and Bradley was finally going to face the full consequences of his choices. There's one more thing, Charlotte added. The prosecutor wants to interview you as a victim. Nothing complicated, just your statement about how Bradley's actions affected you, the emotional and financial damage he caused. Are you willing to do that? Yes, I said without hesitation. I want him to hear exactly what he did to me. I want it on the record. Good. Because I think it's time for Bradley to understand that you were never just a woman he could erase. You were always much more than he realized, and now the whole world is going to know it. As I hung up the phone, I walked out onto the trailer's small deck and looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, Bradley was sitting in a jail cell, probably still trying to figure out how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. But I knew the answer to that question. Everything had gone wrong for Bradley the moment he'd underestimated the woman he'd tried to destroy. He'd thought I was weak because I was kind, helpless because I avoided conflict, forgettable because I was quiet. He'd been wrong about all of it. And now he was going to have the rest of his life to think about just how wrong he'd been. 3 weeks later, I was back in my house, supervising a professional cleaning crew as they eliminated the last traces of my aromatic sabotage campaign. The ghost hunter activity had died down once news of Bradley's arrest spread, and the supernatural explanations for the property's problems gave way to more mundane criminal ones. I decided to keep the house after all. There had been talk of selling it and starting fresh somewhere else, but as I walked through the rooms that Richard and I had shared, I realized I wasn't ready to let go of this place yet. It was still the site of my happiest memories, still the home where I'd learned what love really meant. Bradley's attempts to erase our history had failed completely. In trying to steal my inheritance, he'd ensured that I would inherit everything. In trying to make me disappear, he'd forced me to discover strength I'd never known I possessed. In trying to destroy my connection to this house, he'd made me fight for it in a way that made it truly mine. The cleaning crew was just finishing when Charlotte arrived with the final paperwork. "It's official," she announced, setting her briefcase down in the living room that had once again become mine. "The court has approved the asset forfeiture order. Everything Bradley owned now belongs to you. Free and clear." She handed me a thick folder containing deeds, account transfers, and investment statements. The house, obviously, plus 4 rental properties in various stages of renovation, 2 office buildings in Hartford, and enough liquid assets to ensure you'll never have to worry about money again. I flipped through the documents, still struggling to process the magnitude of what had happened. What am I supposed to do with 4 rental properties? Whatever you want. Keep them as investments, sell them, donate them to charity. They're yours now. You have options, Margot. You have freedom. Freedom. That was exactly what this was, I realized. Not just financial freedom, though that was certainly part of it, but freedom from fear, from dependency, from the need to accommodate people who didn't value me. Freedom to be exactly who I was without apology or explanation. What about Bradley's trial? Still proceeding. His public defender is trying to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutor isn't interested. They want to make an example of him. Real estate fraud has become a serious problem in Connecticut, and they think a high-profile conviction will deter others. How is he handling jail? Charlotte's expression grew darker. Not well. Apparently, he's been making phone calls constantly, trying to find someone who'll help him with bail or legal fees. But most of his associates have distanced themselves once they realize the extent of his criminal activities. Has he tried to call me? Actually, yes. The jail keeps a record of all outgoing calls, and you're on his list. But since you changed your phone number... I had changed my number, partly for security reasons, but mostly because I didn't want to deal with Bradley's increasingly desperate attempts to contact me. Let him face the consequences of his actions without my help or forgiveness. Charlotte, there's something I've been thinking about. Something I want to do with part of this money. What's that? I want to create a legal defense fund for other people who've been victimized by family members trying to steal their inheritances. Especially older women who get targeted by greedy relatives after their spouses die. Charlotte's eyes lit up with professional interest. That's actually a brilliant idea. Elder financial abuse is a huge problem that doesn't get nearly enough attention. Most victims don't have the resources to fight back effectively.
Exactly.
I was lucky I had you. I had some advantages that other women might not have. But what about the ones who don't? What about the widows who get bullied into signing over their property because they're too scared or too isolated to resist? You want to level the playing field. I want to make sure that what Bradley tried to do to me becomes much harder to do to other people. I want predatory relatives to know that their victims might have access to serious legal help. We spent the next hour discussing the practical details of establishing such a fund. Charlotte knew lawyers who specialized in elder law, victims advocates who worked with financial abuse cases, and nonprofit organizations that could help structure the program effectively. We could start with $500,000, I suggested. Enough to handle several major cases while we're building the program and seeking additional funding. Margot, are you sure about this? You've just inherited a fortune. Most people would want to enjoy it, not give it away. Charlotte, I didn't fight Bradley to get rich. I fought him to prove that I couldn't be erased, that I mattered, that my marriage to Richard meant something. Now that I've proven all of that, the money is just money. I'd rather use it to help other people who are facing what I faced. Richard would be proud, Charlotte said softly. I think so too. As Charlotte gathered her papers and prepared to leave, she paused at the front door. Margot, there's one more thing I should tell you. About Bradley's phone calls from jail. What about them? According to the records, he's tried to call you 127 times since his arrest. Every few hours, sometimes multiple times per day. The jail staff says he becomes agitated when the calls don't go through. 127 calls. More than the 100 he'd made the night after Christmas dinner, when he'd first realized that his plan to humiliate me had backfired. But those calls had been angry, desperate attempts to control a situation that was slipping away from him. These new calls were something different, the desperate appeals of someone who'd finally understood the magnitude of what he'd lost. Do you think he's genuinely sorry? I asked. I think he's genuinely desperate. Whether that's the same thing as being sorry, that's for you to decide. After Charlotte left, I walked through the house slowly, reacquainting myself with spaces that felt both familiar and foreign. It was still my home, but I was no longer the same woman who'd lived here before. The grieving widow who'd been so easily intimidated by Bradley's threats had been replaced by someone harder, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous to people who mistook kindness for weakness. In Richard's study, I found the wedding photo I'd looked at on that first terrible day when Bradley had called to destroy my world. We looked so happy in that picture, so confident in our love and our future together. Richard's arms were around me, and we were both laughing at something the photographer had said. I did it, I said to the photo. I fought for us. I fought for our marriage and our home and our memory. And I won. I could almost hear Richard's voice responding, proud and amazed. I always knew you were stronger than you thought, my love. I just wish it hadn't taken something like this to prove it. That evening, I made myself dinner in the kitchen where Bradley had tried to convince buyers that a grieving widow had never really lived. I ate at the table where Richard and I had shared thousands of meals and conversations and quiet moments of domestic happiness. The house felt peaceful now, cleansed of Bradley's presence and restored to its rightful purpose as a home rather than a commodity to be bought and sold. The ghost stories had been true in a way. There had been a restless spirit haunting this place. But it hadn't been supernatural. It had been me fighting to reclaim what was mine. As I was getting ready for bed, the landline rang. I'd kept the old number for the house, partly out of nostalgia and partly because I was expecting calls from contractors and service providers as I settled back in. But when I answered, I heard the automated message that indicated a call from the county jail. This is a collect call from an inmate at Fairfield County Correctional Facility. To accept charges, press 1. To decline, press 2 or hang up. Bradley. Still trying to reach me, still hoping that somehow he could convince me to help him. I pressed 2 and hung up immediately. Let him make 100 more calls if he wanted. Let him sit in that cell and think about what he'd lost, about the life he'd thrown away through greed and arrogance, and the casual cruelty he'd shown to someone who'd never done him any harm. I'd given him 15 years of patience and accommodation and attempts at family harmony. I'd endured his resentment and his barely concealed hostility and his constant implications that I was an interloper in his father's life. But I didn't owe him forgiveness. I didn't owe him help. I didn't owe him anything at all. What I owed was to Richard's memory, to the other victims of family financial abuse, and to myself. and I was finally in a position to pay all of those debts in full. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs to the bedroom I'd shared with Richard, I felt something I hadn't experienced since his death: complete peace. The future stretched ahead of me, full of possibilities and choices, and the freedom to be exactly who I wanted to be. Bradley had tried to write me out of the story, to make me disappear without a trace. Instead, he'd given me the chance to become the protagonist of my own life in a way I'd never been before. And that, more than all the money or property or legal victories, was the sweetest revenge of all. 6 months later, I was in my garden, our garden, planting the roses that Richard had always wanted but never quite got around to ordering. It was a beautiful spring morning, with the kind of soft light that made even ordinary tasks feel meaningful, and I was taking my time with the planting, enjoying the feeling of my hands in the earth and the promise of beauty to come. The legal proceedings were finally complete. Bradley had been convicted on all charges and sentenced to 18 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of state time. His assets had been officially transferred to me, and I'd used a substantial portion of them to establish the Delaney Foundation for Elder Justice, a legal defense fund that had already helped dozens of older adults fight back against financial abuse by family members. I'd kept the house and one of the rental properties as investments, but I'd sold the others and donated the proceeds to various charities that supported widows and victims of elder abuse. It felt good to turn Bradley's ill-gotten gains into something that would help rather than harm. Charlotte had become the Foundation's chief legal counsel, and we'd built a network of attorneys across New England who specialized in elder law and financial abuse cases. Already, we'd seen 3 major victories: cases where predatory relatives had been forced to return stolen assets to their elderly victims, along with substantial damages for emotional distress. The work was satisfying in a way that my previous career, fulfilling as it had been, never quite achieved. There was something deeply meaningful about helping other people find the strength to fight back against those who sought to diminish them. But the real measure of my recovery wasn't professional or financial. It was personal. I'd learned to live alone without feeling lonely, to enjoy my own company without needing constant validation from others. I'd made new friends through the foundation and reconnected with old ones I'd neglected during the dark period after Richard's death. Most importantly, I'd forgiven myself for the years of accommodation and peacekeeping that had enabled Bradley's behavior. I understood now that trying to maintain family harmony wasn't a character flaw. It was a reasonable response to an unreasonable person. The problem hadn't been my approach. It had been Bradley's fundamental lack of decency and respect. I was tamping soil around the base of a particularly beautiful rose bush when I heard footsteps on the garden path behind me. I turned to see the mail carrier approaching with a handful of letters and what appeared to be a certified package. "Good morning, Mrs. Delaney. Beautiful day for gardening." "It certainly is. Anything interesting today?" "Well, there's this certified letter from the Department of Corrections. Looks official." I signed for the package with a sense of curiosity rather than dread. The return address indicated it was from the federal prison where Bradley was serving his sentence, but it wasn't from Bradley himself. It was from the warden's office. Inside the official envelope was a smaller envelope with my name written in Bradley's familiar handwriting, along with a cover letter from the prison explaining that the enclosed correspondence had been reviewed and approved for delivery according to standard procedures. I sat on the garden bench where Richard and I used to enjoy our morning coffee and opened Bradley's letter with careful deliberation. After everything that had happened, I owed it to myself to read what he had to say, not because I needed his apologies or explanations, but because I was curious about what kind of person he'd become after 18 months in prison. The letter was written on standard prison stationery in Bradley's careful script. "Dear Margot, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, and I understand why. I know you've ignored my phone calls and probably threw away other letters I tried to send. But the counselor here says that making amends is an important part of taking responsibility for what I did, so I'm going to try one more time to tell you how sorry I am. I've had a lot of time to think about what I did to you and, more importantly, why I did it. The truth is that I was angry about Dad's death, and instead of dealing with that grief in a healthy way, I decided that you were somehow to blame for it. Not rationally, I knew you hadn't caused his heart attack, but emotionally. I convinced myself that if he hadn't been so happy with you, he would have taken better care of himself, lived longer, stayed around to see me become successful. I know that doesn't make sense. I know it's unfair and cruel and completely wrong. But it's what I told myself to justify the resentment I'd been carrying for 15 years. The truth is that you were good for Dad. You made him happier than I'd ever seen him, even when I was a kid, and it was just the two of us. You brought laughter and warmth and intellectual companionship into his life in a way that I never could. And instead of being grateful for that, I was jealous. I was jealous of how much he loved you. I was jealous of how easily you fit into his world of books and ideas and academic conversations. I was jealous of the way you could make him smile just by walking into a room. And I was especially jealous of the fact that he'd chosen you over me, which wasn't really true, but it's how it felt. So when he died, and I suddenly had the power to hurt you the way I thought you'd hurt me, I took it. I told myself I was just claiming what was rightfully mine, but really I was trying to punish you for being loved more than I was. What I didn't understand then, and what I'm only beginning to understand now, is that love isn't a competition. Dad, loving you didn't mean he loved me less. Your happiness didn't diminish mine. Your place in his life didn't threaten my place. But by the time I figured that out, I'd already destroyed everything. I'd lost my freedom, my business, my money, and most importantly, my integrity. I'd become exactly the kind of person Dad would have been ashamed to call his son. I know I can't undo what I did to you. I know there's no apology that could possibly make up for the pain I caused or the months of uncertainty and fear you must have endured. I know that saying sorry doesn't give you back the time you lost or repair the damage I did to your sense of security and belonging. But I want you to know that I understand now what you meant to Dad and what he meant to you, and how sacred that relationship was. I want you to know that I'm genuinely sorry. Not just because I got caught, not just because I'm facing consequences, but because I finally understand how much I hurt someone who deserved only kindness and respect. I also want you to know that I'm proud of how you fought back. It took me months to piece together everything you did, the ghost stories, the smells, the way you systematically exposed every aspect of my fraudulent business practices. It was brilliant and creative and exactly the kind of strategic thinking that Dad always said you were capable of. You could have just hired a lawyer and fought me in court. Instead, you made me the architect of my own destruction. You let my own arrogance and criminality destroy me while you built an airtight case that ensured I'd face consequences for everything I'd done, not just what I'd done to you. Dad would have been so proud of your intelligence and your strength. And he would have been ashamed of my stupidity and cruelty. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect you to write back or visit or have anything to do with me ever again. I just wanted you to know that you won, not just legally or financially, but morally. You proved that kindness isn't weakness, that patience isn't passivity, and that underestimating a librarian is one of the stupidest mistakes a person can make. I hope you're happy in the house that's rightfully yours. I hope you've found peace and purpose and maybe even love again. I hope the foundation you started helps other people the way you wish someone could have helped you. And I hope that someday, when enough time has passed and when I've become a better person than I was, you might be able to think of me without anger. Not with forgiveness necessarily, but without the pain I caused you. You were never the problem, Margot. You were always the solution. Dad knew it, and now I know it too. With genuine remorse and deep respect. Bradley. I read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and put it back in its envelope. It was a good letter. Honest, thoughtful, taking full responsibility without making excuses or asking for anything in return. It showed genuine insight into his behavior and real appreciation for what he destroyed. But it also came too late to change anything meaningful between us. I believed that Bradley was genuinely sorry. I believed that he'd grown and learned and become a better person during his time in prison. I even believed that he'd eventually make something positive out of his life once he was released. But I also knew that some relationships, once broken, can't be repaired simply because the person who broke them has evolved. The damage Bradley had done wasn't just to me, it was to the entire foundation of trust and family connection that might have existed between us. And that foundation, once destroyed, couldn't be rebuilt just because he'd had a change of heart. I walked back into the house and sat down at Richard's old desk, where I'd been working on correspondence for the foundation. After thinking for several minutes, I wrote a brief response. Bradley, thank you for your letter. I can see that you've put a lot of thought into understanding what went wrong between us, and I appreciate your honesty about your motivations and actions. I'm glad to hear that you're using your time in prison constructively and that you've gained insight into the choices that led you there. Personal growth is always worthwhile, regardless of circumstances. I want you to know that I don't carry anger toward you anymore. What you did was terrible, but holding on to resentment would only hurt me, not you. I've moved forward with my life and found happiness and purpose that don't depend on your actions or attitudes. I also want you to know that your father loved you deeply, despite your mistakes. He was disappointed by some of your choices, but he never stopped hoping that you would find your way to becoming the person he knew you could be. Perhaps your time in prison will help you become that person. I won't be maintaining contact with you going forward. Not out of cruelty, but because I've built a good life that doesn't include you, and I see no reason to change that. But I wish you well in your efforts to rebuild your character and eventually your life. The foundation I created in Richard's memory has helped many people who face situations similar to what I experienced. In that sense, some good has come from the harm you caused. I hope that knowledge brings you some peace. Take care of yourself. Margot. I sealed the letter and set it aside to mail the next day. Then I returned to my garden, where the roses I'd planted were already showing signs of taking root in the rich soil. By evening, the new plantings were watered and mulched, and the garden looked more beautiful than it had since Richard's death. As the sun set and the first stars appeared, I sat on our old bench with a glass of wine and thought about the strange journey that had brought me to this point. 1.5 years ago, I'd been a broken, grieving widow who thought her life was essentially over. Now I was a financially secure philanthropist running a successful foundation and living exactly the life I wanted to live. Bradley had tried to destroy me, but instead he'd forced me to discover who I really was when everything comfortable and familiar was stripped away. He tried to erase my marriage to Richard, but instead he'd helped me honor that marriage by proving I was worthy of the love Richard had given me. Most importantly, he tried to write me out of the story of the Delaney family, but instead he'd made me the author of a new chapter, one where victims of elder abuse had resources to fight back, where kindness was backed by strength, and where underestimating quiet women proved to be a very expensive mistake. As I sat in the garden that Richard and I had planned together, surrounded by roses that would bloom for years to come, I felt something I'd never experienced before, complete satisfaction with who I was and what I'd accomplished. Bradley was right about one thing. I had won. Not just in court or in terms of money or property, but in the deeper sense of proving that I was strong enough to survive his worst efforts to diminish me. The phone calls had stopped months ago. The desperate letters had dwindled to nothing. Bradley had finally accepted that I wasn't going to rescue him or forgive him or welcome him back into my life. And I was perfectly fine with that. Some stories don't have happy endings for everyone involved. Some people don't get redemption arcs or second chances or the forgiveness they think they deserve. But some stories do have justice. And sometimes, just sometimes, the quiet librarian turns out to be more dangerous than anyone expected. I raised my wine glass to the stars and to Richard's memory and to the woman I'd become through the strangest, most difficult, most transformative year of my life. Here's to true stories, I said aloud. And to the people who refuse to let others write their endings. Then I went inside my house, to plan the next chapter of a story that was entirely my own. Thank you for joining Margot on her incredible journey from victim to victor. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated or dismissed by people who thought they could erase you from their narrative, remember this. You are the author of your own story. No one else gets to write your ending. Margot's tale reminds us that sometimes the quietest people possess the most dangerous intelligence, that patience can be a weapon, and that underestimating a librarian is one of the costliest mistakes anyone can make. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss another story that might speak directly to your soul. Share this video with someone who needs to remember their own strength. And remember, you are worthy of respect, dignity, and justice, especially from the people who should value you most. Until next time, keep writing your own story with courage, intelligence, and the unshakable knowledge that you are stronger than anyone who tries to diminish you.